In this lecture, I plan to deal with the world of early Macedon, and Macedon is the homeland of Alexander the Great and, of course, his father, King Philip II. Although Alexander's mom, Olympias, came from what today is northwestern Greece from the region of Epirus, and Epirus was actually considered part of the Greek world. This lecture is important to bring out several points, and that is the role that Macedon played between the Greek world and the Persian Empire. In 360 BC, when the Greek city-states had fought themselves to exhaustion and the great king of Persia was desperately attempting to bring his rebel satraps and the pharaoh of Egypt under his control, none of the contemporaries would have given much consideration to Macedon. For the longest time, it had been considered essentially on the periphery of the Greek world. Its kings, members of the Argead dynasty, claimed Greek descent. This was eventually accepted as true, and ruled over a mix of different peoples, including Macedonians, but many others as well, none of whom were regarded as Hellenes, or members of the Greek national race, a question that we'll get into, which is very controversial in the modern state of Greece today. To Greeks of the classical world, the Macedonians would have been regarded as barbarians, and there's a number of reasons for that. First, Macedon, in its climate and geography, is really an extension or just part of the Balkan Peninsula. It really isn't part of the Mediterranean world. And when I speak of Macedon in antiquity, as opposed to the way the term is used today, much of what is known as Lower Macedon, which is today the heart of northern Greece, was centered on the valleys of the Oxus and Ludas rivers. These are alluvial rivers that rise in the Balkans and bring rich soil and deposit this soil and build up a delta in what is known as the Thamaric Gulf. Very close to the shores were two capital cities, one at Aegae, modern Vergina, where the kings were traditionally buried, and there are important tombs that were found there by Greek archaeologists in the 1970s, and we'll speak about them in a coming lecture. And the other was Pella, the political capital, long the political capital of the Argead kings. These cities, in many ways, were not really Greek cities at all. In the time of 360 BC, just before Philip II came to the throne, they did not have the institutions of Greek city-state, a polis. They were royal capitals. There were no independent organs of government such as an assembly, a council, elected magistrates. In some ways, the cities by 360 BC would have had the trappings of Greek civilization. The royal family built its palaces in a Greek style. They decorated them with mosaics, and some marvelous mosaics, Greek-style mosaics, have come to light from the 4th century BC. And they bought a lot of Greek wares and goods. In some ways and manners, the Macedonian nobles and royal family would approximate their Greek contemporaries, at least Greek aristocrats. But in many other ways, the Macedonians were really not Greeks at all. First, the kingdom was a hodgepodge of regions in what is today northern Greece that were brought under control by the Macedonian kings from between the 8th and the 6th century BC. They included some very important districts to the west. These western districts, like Lynkestras, Elymia, and Orestis, particularly, were home to proud nobles, essentially feudal barons, who only gave their loyalty to the kings of Pella if those kings were strong. And it was really to the credit of Philip II and later Alexander the Great that these noble families were won over and turned into the servants of the Argead monarchy and furnished many of the leading generals of both Philip and Alexander. To the east, particularly to the regions immediately north of the peninsula of the Chalcidice, that three-pronged peninsula in northern Greece today, which was home to many Greek city-states founded in the Archaic Age, that is in the 7th and 6th century BC, by Greeks coming from the central islands of the Aegean. Just north of these city-states were a variety of local peoples living in regions like Mygdonia, Bisaltia, and other districts, inhabited by people whose origins are still really unknown to us. The Macedonians proper, the Macedones, the tall ones, is apparently what the name means, lived in what is today northern Greece, the regions around Pella and Vergina, in the plains, and they do not seem to have been part of that Greek nationality for several reasons. First, these regions of Macedon were not part of the Greek civilization of the Bronze Age. And it is increasingly clear from archaeology that between 1600 and 1200 BC, the Bronze Age civilization of Greece, centered on the great palaces of southern Greece, the so-called Mycenaean or Achaean palaces, those palaces were really the beginning of at least Greek civilization, maybe not political institutions, but the religious and cultural and economic institutions. Macedon is not part of that Bronze Age world. In the ensuing centuries, when this Bronze Age collapse occurred in Greece, Macedon seems to have been little affected by the migrations that led to the rearrangements of Greek dialects and Greek populations in the Greek homeland. And the Macedonians, as far as we can tell, and this is a surmise that has been the result of 2 generations of work by philologists, that is, experts in language, archaeologists, and historians, notably Professor Eugene Borza, whose work on Macedon is really a turning point in scholarship, and I owe a great deal to his work in the shadow of Olympus for this lecture. And Professor Borza and I have been friends for many years. And as he points out, the Macedonian language, as far as we can tell, was unintelligible to the Greeks. There are a number of indications of this. The most famous is in 328 BC, when Alexander gets into a drunken brawl with one of his officers, Clytus, and calls for his guard to arrest Clytus, and we're told by Plutarch, speaks in the Macedonian language because there were Greeks present, and Alexander did not want these Greeks to understand what he had just shouted. There's other indications that the inscriptions set up in Macedon in the time of Alexander the Great and earlier were done by Greek stonecutters, and the dialect of Greek, and Greek is divided into a series of different dialects, the dialect of Greek in these inscriptions is the dialect of the stonecutter. It's Dorian, it's Ionic, there's even, I gather, a couple of Thessalian and Aeolic inscriptions. And what it indicates is that there isn't any kind of Macedonian Greek dialect as far as we can tell. Now, most of the information we have on the Macedonian language is very limited. It's personal names and certain technical terms. But there seems a good reason to believe that Macedonian, while remotely related to Greek, goes back to a common Indo-European ancestor, in the time of Philip and Alexander was essentially unintelligible to most Greeks. Furthermore, Greeks found the Macedonian kings an anomaly. Those Greek intellectuals, such as Socrates, the Pan-Hellenist, figures such as Aeschines and Philocrates, who are political figures in Athens in the time of Philip II, who urged accommodation with Philip, they would call the royal family Greek. And they would then qualify it, and you Greek kings ruling over a barbarian people. It was inconceivable to Greeks that any Greek would put himself willingly under a king. Now, there were kings in Sparta, but these were constitutional rulers, essentially hereditary military commanders, and there were 2 of them. And in Sparta, both kings, the Agiad and Eurypontid kings, simply hated each other and never cooperated, and the Spartans lived under the rule of law. They lived under the institutions of a polis. So, from the viewpoint of the Greek world, the Macedonians were just not Greeks. They didn't have the political institutions, their language was unintelligible, and above all, their burial customs and mores were absolutely dreadful to the Greeks. For one, the Macedonians drank unmixed wine. Any well-trained Greek knows that at a symposium, at a drinking event, that you drank wine cut with water. In fact, it was usually a 1-to-1 ratio if you were a good host. Whereas in Macedon, they drank the stuff neat. There's lots of reports about Macedonian kings having these long all-night drinking sessions. Philip II excelled in them, but this was just standard fare for the Macedonians. Furthermore, any Greek coming to the court at Pella, the political capital of Macedon, and invited to participate in this symposium would find it quite different from what you would find in a Greek city-state. In a city such as Athens, a symposium was an occasion for learned disputation. Political matters might be discussed. That is, democracy is no good, we should have an oligarchy. That's very common in certain circles in Athens. Or literary and intellectual topics. Many of Plato's dialogues are set where Socrates is talking to Alcibiades, that marvelous, irreverent figure of Athenian politics. Whereas a drinking party at the court of Pella probably is a combination of the old Homeric strong-arm drinking parties you would have of these bellicose warriors who had very little regard for anything intellectual, and was sort of a preview to the Viking Age and Hell's Angels. I mean, I'm sure that most Greeks were horrified at what went on at the court of Pella, and there were some really extraordinary events that are reported in the sources. In their burial customs, the Macedonians, who live in close proximity to peoples known as the Thracians, to the east, in what is now Bulgaria, to the Illyrians, to the north and to the northwest. These are people who are decidedly non-Greek. There are a great deal of similarities. Archaeology has revealed this. And finally, the Macedonians, who did not live in a city-state and they were ruled by kings, did not have the conceit that they were separated from the rest of the world because they lived under the rule of law. Greeks, or Hellenes, to use the name that they would use, always saw themselves as distinct from the rest of the world because they lived under the rule of law, eunomia, that the citizens voted various laws into actions. These were implemented by the citizens through juries, through courts, and elected magistrates, and officials were held to an account. It also meant that the Greeks did not tend to intermarry with foreign peoples, and it was a major breakthrough by the Athenian intellectual Socrates to admit the fact that barbarians, and barbarian simply means non-Greek speaker, that barbarians, or foreigners is perhaps a better term, could become Hellenes if they adopted the Greek language and Greek political institutions and lived in a polis. That was a major concession in the 4th century BC. In the case of the Macedonian ruling house and its nobility, the policy of the Argead kings was to not only beat your rivals on the battlefield, but to marry them. Every time Philip went to war, he picked up an extra wife, and many of these women were Illyrians, Thracians, some were Greeks, such as Thessalians. Alexander's mother, Olympias, was Greek. She was from the royal family of Epirus, which was marginally Greek, but still regarded as Greek. And the Macedonians had no such bar, and this explains Alexander's attitude toward the Persian aristocracy when he conquers the Persian Empire. In his mind, marrying high-born Persian women was perfectly acceptable. Now, the Greeks would be aghast at this, but this was common policy in the Macedonian world. They were essentially monarchists. They believed in a monarchy. The nobility and the peasants gave their loyalty to the Argead house, and this is a very, very non-Greek way in governing yourselves. And it's an important point that must be stressed. The historian I mentioned in the first lecture, who summed up the heroic image of Alexander coming out of the 19th and early 20th century, and see Alexander the Great as their king, as a Greek king, as a man who conquered the Persian Empire to spread Greek civilization. They even went so far as to issue coins to demonstrate that Macedon was Greek and always Greek. I believe it's a 100 drachma piece. On the obverse is the head of Alexander the Great, based on an ancient coin with Alexander's portrait, and the horn of Zeus Ammon, which is Alexander as a deified king. And on the reverse is the inscription Demokratia Hellenica, Hellenic democracy, which is totally illogical. Alexander had no tolerance for democracy one way or the other. He tolerated it if the Greeks want to run it that way, but to him it was just a ridiculous form of government. And the fact that Alexander spoke Greek and in some ways was culturally Greek did not make him politically Greek. So these claims over territorial claims between modern Greece and the Republic of Macedon really have very little to do with antiquity. They're very, very sensitive and controversial issues. I know they will spark all sorts of claims and criticisms, but fundamentally, as a historian who has absolutely no interest either way on what the modern situation is, as far as we can tell, the Macedonians were a non-Greek people who came under very, very heavy Greek influence culturally, starting in the 6th century BC, and then in the reign of their king Alexander I, who ruled about 498 to 454 BC, the kings of Macedon, and this is a remarkable story in Herodotus, applied to the judges at Olympia, claiming that they were descended from none other than Heracles, the Roman Hercules. They also threw in King Perseus of Argos for good measure, and it was accepted that the Macedonian kings were Greek. We don't know if these claims are real or not. The Macedonian royal family did have some Greek ancestors. They intermarried with certain Greek aristocrats. And from that point onward, the Greeks regarded the Macedonians their kings as Greeks. That did not extend to the rest of the Macedonian population. And as I said, even the strongest supporters of Philip and Alexander might call Phil and Alex Greeks, but they ruled essentially over a barbarian people, Macedonians, who drink their wine unmixed, and we can't understand them no matter what they say. On the other hand, the royal family made a real effort to project themselves as Hellenes in certain ways. King Perdiccas II, who was the king during the Peloponnesian War, and his son and successor Archelaus, who was particularly important, he ruled from 413 to 399 BC, they made every effort to turn Pella and Vergina, that is the religious capital is at Vergina, it's the ancient city of Aegae, into Greek-looking cities. They brought in Greek artists. They started publishing public inscriptions in the Greek language. Attic Greek, that is the language of Athens, was officially adopted as the language of the Macedonian court by King Archelaus. That is a very significant point, and if one is looking for a very rough analogy, one could think of the Russian aristocracy of the late 18th and early 19th century, which used French, but was definitely Russian. One thinks of Tsar Alexander I, who, by the way, given his name, liked to style himself as a follower of Alexander the Great, and he's got a lot of company historically. Alexander I, the Tsar of Russia, loved to correct the spelling and punctuation of Napoleon because Alexander I spoke better French than Napoleon, who came from Corsica. That didn't mean Alexander I or any of his nobility were French, even though they were French in many ways, linguistically and culturally. And I think you should think of the Macedonian royal family and eventually the aristocracy along those lines, that they bought Greek products and goods, that they used Greek in diplomatic and other types of correspondence. They assimilated their gods to the Greek equivalents. They eventually begin to use the Greek title Basileus to describe their monarch. We don't really know what the Macedonian title for king is, but it was probably not Basileus in earlier ages. It comes to be used in the time of Alexander and later. And as I mentioned in an earlier lecture, in some ways, the Argead kings of Macedon should be compared to other non-Greek peoples who came under very, very strong Greek influence, in which their kings or dynasts, sometimes they didn't have the title king, but they ruled as monarchs or strongmen, were known as Philhellenes. That is, they loved things Greek. The most telling example of that in the 4th century BC comes from Mausolus. Mausolus is the son of a local dynast in Caria, and Caria is in southwestern Turkey today. The Carians are a native Anatolian people. It is now clear that they spoke a language that goes into the Bronze Age, and they are descended from an Anatolian people from the Hittite Age in the Bronze Age. They were in close association with Greeks, particularly Greeks settled on the shores of Asia Minor. In earliest times, Herodotus tells us that Greeks and Carians intermarried. The Carians used an alphabet that was similar to the Greek alphabet, modified for their language, but they were a distinct Anatolian people. Mausolus in 377 BC achieved a position of dominance in southwestern Asia Minor, and he ruled to his death in 353 BC. He came to control not only Caria, but a region known as Lycia to the southeast of Caria, various cities of Asia Minor. In some ways, he was seen as a far greater threat than Philip II, who was his contemporary, and the Athenians were extremely concerned that Mausolus would extend his control over the islands of Greece, notably the naval republic of Rhodes. Mausolus actually backed dissident Athenian allies in a war known as the Social War, which raged from 357 to 355 BC. And social is an unfortunate term. It means allied. It comes from the Latin socii for allied. So it doesn't mean social as we understand the word, as a society, social institutions, sociology, the way we would use it today in modern English. In any event, Mausolus really conducted himself as a Philhellene king. His court used Greek. He remodeled the shrines of Caria along Greek lines. The most spectacular is Labronda, which is atop a mountain near the ancient city of Mylasa, in which there's a very active building program by him, his wife, his brothers who follow him, to turn the shrine into a Greek-looking shrine. He consults the Oracle of Delphi. He issues coins that are Greek-inspired with Greek inscriptions. He hires large numbers of Greek mercenaries. He moves his capital to Halicarnassus, the hometown of Herodotus, a Greek city. and sets up his court at Halicarnassus. He commissions the great mausoleum, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, which is built in a Greek style, but he remains first and foremost an Anatolian monarch. He has Greek trappings, he uses the Greek language, he uses Greek mercenaries, but there's no question that he's a Carian dynast, and he doubles as a satrap for the great king of Persia, Artaxerxes II, and proves a very loyal and able satrap who extends his position into essentially a almost virtually independent monarch in southwestern Asia Minor. He is at the head of what is known as the Hectomanid dynasty. That is a family descended from a common ancestor, and his the last Hectomanid dynast is a Queen Ada, who is ruling in Caria at the time that Alexander the Great shows up, and he favors her, puts her into in control of Caria. She adopts him, that is Alexander, as her son and heir, and in 326 BC, when she dies, Caria essentially passes to Alexander. Mausolus, in many ways, is similar to Philip II of Macedon, who will be appearing in the coming lectures. That is, he is not from a Greek race. He is a monarch, both in name and disposition, but he comes to embrace Greek civilization, use Greek institutions, use Greek military technology and mercenaries to make himself one of the most effective kings in the Aegean world. And that's what the kings of Macedon themselves aspired to. That is what essentially Philip II achieved, and it's important to stress that to the Athenians in the 350s BC, Philip comes to the throne in 359 BC, saw Mausolus as a far more dangerous rival than they saw Philip II. They didn't realize what Phil had in store for them, and by the time they recognized Philip, it was too late, in my opinion. So the Kingdom of Macedon is then part of the wider Greek world. It's heavily influenced by Greek civilization, but it still technically is not really Greece. The Argead kings themselves, from the Greek viewpoint in 360 BC, didn't seem to pose much of a threat. For the longest time, the kings of Macedon were really quite weak. The western barons in Lynkestris, Orestis, Elamiah were essentially virtual independent kings. Any king who came to the throne in Pella had to bring these proud nobles, who were virtually kings in all but name, back under control. The kings in Pella and Aegae at the time lived very close to the sea. Today, those cities are very far inland because of the silting up of the Axius River. They were subject to easy coercion by first the Athenians, later by the Spartans and the Thebans. And it would be very, very easy for the Athenians to back a pretender to the throne of Macedon and land an army on the shores of Macedon and really complicate the succession of the Argead family. And throughout the entire of the 5th century BC, first King Perdiccas II and then his son Archelaus lived in fear that the Athenians could raise up pretenders with no problem, provide them with money and mercenaries, and overthrow the monarch in Pella. To the north and to the east were powerful barbarian peoples, above all the Thracians. The Odrysian kings of Thrace were seen for the longest time as a far greater opponent than any of the Macedonian kings, and the Thracians and Illyrians repeatedly would attack the border regions of Macedon to the north and the east, plunder these regions, carry off cattle, livestock, peasants, women, you name it. And throughout the 5th and early 4th century BC, the Argead kings were really not in much of a position to challenge these neighbors, who in many instances were wilder and far more barbaric and dreaded than the Macedonians themselves, who had come under a certain amount of Greek influence. And finally, the Macedonian kings, really in the whole political game of the 5th century BC, were not particularly impressive. Their king Amyntas submitted to Persian rule. When Xerxes marched through Macedon in 480 BC, King Alexander I, the man who got certified to be a Greek king of Macedon, did everything in his power to hurry the Persian army through Macedon and played a rather dubious role in the entire war in 480 to 479 BC that saw the defeat of the Persians in Greece. And Alexander I's prime concern was preserving his throne, and he really rather admired the great king of Persia. After all, it would be really great if the Argead king could be the equivalent of the great king of Persia and issue orders to his nobles that sometimes might even be paid attention to. Furthermore, the kings of Macedon found themselves without the kind of military power that their neighbors had. Until the military reforms of Philip II, the Macedonian army wasn't much to look at. Now, the population was large. In 359 BC, when Philip II comes to the throne, the population of the kingdom of Macedon may be twice that of Athens. Athens was regarded as the most populous city-state in the Aegean world. Maybe there were 500,000 residents in the kingdom of Macedon, somewhere between 150,000 men who could be armed. But until Philip II, this army didn't amount to much. Macedonian kings depended very heavily on Greek mercenaries for infantry, because the infantry in Macedon was nothing more than peasant levies. They did very little service on the battlefield. Actually, most of the time, they got in the way of the Macedonian cavalry, and there's several instances where the Macedonian cavalry would ride over their own peasants in order to close with the enemy. The cavalry was excellent, but it comprised various nobles and sub-kings from different parts of Macedon who styled themselves as great heroic figures rather than fighting as a disciplined cavalry. This, too, would have to be changed by Philip, who would train the Macedonian nobility to fight as professional soldiers rather than a bunch of heroes out of the Iliad. So that in terms of military potential, the Macedonians, while they had the manpower, they had excellent horses. Macedon was home to a great amount of timber, hides, and metals. It really was very, very difficult for these kings to utilize these resources, to equip an effective army, and even more difficult was to inculcate some sort of loyalty in this army where it could be used as an effective royal instrument. So in 360 BC, there wasn't really much concern that Macedon represented a distant threat. And therefore, in 360 BC, the year I chose to state that everyone in the Greek world at that point realized that Athens, Sparta, and Thebes had essentially fought themselves to a standstill. In 360 BC, Macedon was of very little account. And in the next year, 359 BC, news would have been received by the Greek city-states that the then ruling king of Macedon, a fellow named Perdiccas III, had been killed in a battle against the Illyrians, that some 4,000 Macedonians had fallen in the battle, that the Illyrians had plundered northern Macedon, driving off livestock and peasants, that the Thracians had overrun certain regions of Macedon, that at least two different pretenders appeared, one of them backed by the Athenians. The lords of Western Macedon refused to recognize Pella, and the man who was elected or chosen king, Philip II, who was the brother of Perdiccas III, was just one more Macedonian king, and this was politics as usual. Macedonian kings always faced these difficulties when they came to the throne. They faced rivals in Western Macedon, barbarians on the frontiers, pretenders backed by Athens or whoever was the leading Greek city-state. And so they gave very little concern to this. Little did they know that the king who came to the throne in 359 BC would build on Macedonian institutions, royal institutions going back into the 5th century BC, would forge a whole new army that required a virtual social and economic rewrite of Macedon and would make himself the greatest king of Europe and unite Greece. His name is Philip II, the father of Alexander the Great.